Hi, good evening. My name is Rafiq Gubran, and I am the Dean of the Faculty of Engineering and Design here at Carleton. So welcome to the Roadmap lecture featuring Marc Dulude. So please note that tonight's lecture will be videotaped so that the ideas discussed here can be shared with Carleton graduates, future Carleton students, and other students around the world who are also thinking about their career path. So Roadmaps is a lecture series founded in part by Carleton alumni, and it examines the path that global leaders and entrepreneurs have followed from university to professional success. So engineers take many and varied paths in their careers, and sometimes one that's not predictable as well. So to help you on your route from the classroom to an outstanding career, I hope that you'll find lessons, surprises, inspirations in the path chosen by those who have gone before you helpful to you as well. So tonight's lecture can help you eliminate the many doors your Carleton degree can open for you. So tonight's lectures is given by a Carleton graduate. Marc Dulude earned his bachelor's and master's degrees from mechanical engineering here at Carleton University. So after a quick foray into software, information technology, Marc moved into management positions. So he worked at Ottawa-based Bell Northern Research and US-based Parametric Technology Corporation, so supporting products lifecycle management, software solutions, and he's been involved in many, many fields, as we'll hear from his presentation. So as Chief Executive Officer of Moldflow, Marc directed the company's global operations and initial public offerings of stock on the NASDAQ, one of the top-ranked IPOs in the 2000s. So Marc has also experience with one of the most successful private equity firms in the world. As a general partner with Ampersand Capital, he was responsible for all aspects of the partnership, from fundraising through deal sourcing, investment, portfolio, company management, and liquidity. So in his current position as chairman and CEO of RAND Worldwide, Marc orchestrated the merger of two competitors, a unique challenge that I'm sure you'll hear about as well. So he's responsible for setting the direction, culture, and the evolution of the company, and manages all aspects of RAND Worldwide group of companies. I'm delighted to have Marc with us today. As a successful executive with experience in a range of industries and business models, Marc understands what it takes to take companies public, to buy and sell them, to turn them into profitable organizations and merge them. He has proven insight into developing and bringing to market products that people buy today. Tonight, he will share with us the roadmap that led from engineers to executive, and it's my pleasure to introduce Marc Dulude.
Great, thank you very much, Dean, and we're on and ready to go. And I will typically tend to pace, and I'll make really good eye contact with you, enough to make you nervous. I'm about to ask you a question, and there is a test, and so you do need to pay attention. So thank you very much for inviting me. I actually don't think that my career is that illuminating or that intriguing, but perhaps you will find a couple of lessons in some of the steps that I've taken. The changes here have been quite remarkable for me. I just had a tour from people that were extremely influential in my life here at Carleton and for my life afterwards as well. And another theme that will come through is on reflection, how some very innocuous moments in your life turn out to be the deciding factor or the catalyst that leads to one step and then the next step. And they're not foreseeable, they're not knowable up front. But if you are open to them, if you sort of think about the people that you're working with and accept guidance, make your decisions that you feel work for you, somehow things just seem to work out. So for me, Dr. John Goldak, Herb Saravanamuthu, Steen Schollander, Dick Kind, Joe Wong, these were people that were incredibly influential in my life. I did my thesis with Dr. Goldak and Dr. Schollander. I did my fourth-year project when it was still an individual thing with Dr. Saravanamuthu. So for me, these were formative years. And in fact, I was asked the question, earlier when I was speaking with the dean, saying, so why'd you decide to do a master's right after your bachelor's? And for me, it was just seemed so right. I was having a great time. I loved being at Carleton. I was enjoying all of the subject matter. I didn't even apply for a job. I just wanted to keep going, and I had an interesting topic. It wasn't part of some master plan. You know, if I do this, then I can get to here, then I can do this other thing. And I hope that this is actually going to come across in my talk, is I've never had such a plan. For me, I was really interested in fluid mechanics. I was really interested in programming. And Dr. Goldak and Dr. Scholander were two guys that we could marry together, and it was fantastic for me. So I did say earlier to some of the people that might have overheard is I actually can encapsulate everything having to do with achieving some sort of corporate or material success in one slide. And then, of course, you're all free to go afterwards. But it really is as simple as if you want to experience material success, just be lucky. It really is as simple as that. My wife hates it when I say that because, you know, she takes a look and she's seen a lot of the hard work that went into it. But almost without exception, everybody that I've spoken with or that I've known, and I've known a lot of very, very successful people, I've somehow have, you know, been in that circle, all of them acknowledge and recognize just how lucky they were, just happened to do something that was not part of a plan, just did something that led to somewhere else. And then before you knew it, things were happening and they were positive. But it's not just by happenstance. So yes, being lucky really is important, but since I can't teach you how to be lucky, I figure we should probably do a little bit more than that as well. And so the luck has rarely been sufficient. Usually, you know, that old cliche, right? The harder I work, the luckier I get. It is a cliche because it's true. And so one of the things that I think is key, and this is, pay attention, this is on the test, the only true differentiator any of us has any longer is the willingness to work hard. You know, it used to be, you're not used to this, but it used to be that if you were born in a certain area or you went to the right schools or you went in the right geographies, that you had a leg up. But we now compete with everybody in the world every moment. Anybody can start coming up with their own theories, their own products. You see it all the time now. And so the only way that people can succeed today is by willing to work harder than anybody else. And I hope that this actually ends up coming up as a theme all the way through for me as well. As yes, I have been extremely fortunate. And as I reflect on how in the world did that happen, it was luck. But I had also set up the environment to be able to take advantage of the luck. So I have had several times in my career when I have, as I like to call it, put the hammer down. 16 hours a day, 7 days a week, things that just needed to be done. And those are just the price that you pay if you want to succeed and if you sort of have that desire. But I don't want you to think that, you know what, if I just do 16 hours a day, 7 days a week, I will succeed. No. There's a lot of lucky aspect to it. It's also working on the right things. Something else that is in that category of working hard is a willingness to change, because that actually is hard. So if you're doing the same thing over and over and over again, and it's not working, you're not going to be successful. Most people actually don't want to change. They say they do, but then when it actually comes down to it, they come up with all sorts of code phrases on how they're not going to change. They say, you know, it's just the way I am. Just accept it. That's just who I am. Or they'll end up saying things like, you know what, I'll just have to get through this stage, and then I'm going to improve this part, or I'm going to change my approach, and so forth. So people say that, but that's not really a way of working hard. You also have to be willing to make all sorts of changes to the way that you approach the world. And I say that very easily because if I had been invited to this lecture when I was in your seat, I would not have attended. Because I had no interest in business at all. None. I thought salespeople were failed engineers. There's people, you know, if they couldn't do the technical work, who cared about them? I felt I was pretty strong technically. Actually, turns out I was totally wrong. I was pretty weak, but I thought I was pretty strong. And for me, it was like, if I build a better mousetrap, the world will beat away to my door. All this other stuff is, who cares? That's not at all the way that the actual world works, though. So I changed and adapted and saw the world in a different way. And that's, I think, part of what ended up setting me up to be able to succeed somewhat in my career. All right, so now those are backgrounds. How did I actually get from where you are to sort of where I am right now? There are no two paths that are the same, so certainly don't try and replicate. And when you hear how I did it, you'll say, guy's holding back on us. There's no way that it was that haphazard, but no, it really was. So there I was, sitting there and finishing up my schooling, had all these things in mind, what I was going to do for a job, really exciting technical stuff. But you see, there was this woman. That's my wife of almost 26 years. I was telling this story earlier. I actually asked her to marry me the day I met her, and we've been together ever since. And so for me, even though I was finishing up, and I was positive I was going into like a strong technical field, Bernie McIsaac was in the midst of creating a company or growing a company called Gas Tops at the time, gas turbines and other propulsion systems. And there were like hard technical problems to solve, and in Ottawa, and my parents lived here, and I was saying, yeah, that's what I'm going to do. She was living in Montreal. So I didn't make a good technical decision. I didn't make a good career decision. I just decided I was going to follow this woman. So I turned down all the interviews that I was getting, and I went to find a job in Montreal instead. So I called her up. This is kind of like a sidebar just for fun. I call her up on the day I get this job in Montreal, and I say, you know what? I just accepted a job in Montreal, because that's where she lived. She was interning in Montreal. And there's silence on the other end of the line. And I'm thinking, oh my God, have I misjudged this? She had just accepted a job in Ottawa that day. I am not kidding. It couldn't make this story up. Well, perhaps you could, but I didn't. And so I had given my word that I was going to go and take this job, so I actually went to Montreal, worked 2.5 years in that job. She went to Ottawa. Then after I felt I'd lived up to my commitment to the person who had offered me a job, I came back, finally managed to get this woman to marry me. What the heck? And so then I was in Ottawa, and I'll describe that in just a moment. Oh, by the way, when I mentioned this topic to my wife, saying, sort of the steps that I took and, what led to success and so forth, she looked at me like, this is the most easy question to answer ever possible. Just marry the right person. So I put in the plug for her as well. And it is true that in your life, you may not see it now because you're right at the beginning of it, but when you are doing these 16 hours a day, 7 days a week for months on end, having a stable life at home with a supportive spouse or partner or whatever is extremely, extremely important. So I do give a lot of credit to my wife for sort of sticking around with me during all of that period of time. So I did take this job. It was in software. I was programming NC machines, numerically controlled machines. Nothing at all to do with what I had been working on. I had done finite element analysis of fluid mechanics, so Navier-Stokes equations. But I was doing, some programming, and I was also getting to learn a lot about numerically controlled machines and computer-aided manufacturing. Then I actually ended up doing a fellowship at the National Research Council, working in their Industrial Materials Research Institute lab, working on plastics, purely as kind of like a sidebar. And I wrote software to do injection molding simulation. I did that partially at work and partially just for my own fun. And so it ended up with a product that people would be able to use to simulate, at the time, a very complex process, which is injection molding simulation, extremely difficult, nonlinear problem, as all of you, I'm sure, would understand. So 2.5 years, then I decided, okay, I'm moving to be with this woman. And that becomes a theme as well in my career, is I didn't stay anywhere for longer than 5 or 6 years, but I never stayed anywhere shorter than 2 years or 2.5 years. So now that I have the context of having hired literally many thousands of people, done interviews for probably many thousands, perhaps 10,000, I don't know, a very, very large number of interviews. When I see people that are kind of jumping around every 2 years, that's a real danger signal in the career. When I'm taking a look at it, I take a look and say, this is somebody that's never had to conceive of a project, never had to work in a team for a period of time, be responsible for results, and then address whatever shortcomings have come from the work that they did. So a little career advice, you don't want to jump around too quickly, but in today's day and age, people very rarely end up staying in the same institution for 15, 20, 25 years. So for me anyways, I ended up deciding that I was going and changing jobs every 5 or 6 years, and that seemed to coincide with my attention span as well. I sort of felt like when I got to that period of time, I was getting bored. I'd done everything that I wanted to do. It was time for somebody else to add some energy. So not saying it's the same for everybody, but for me, that's what happened. So then I moved from ICAM, that was in Montreal, back to Ottawa, as Dean mentioned, as Rafik mentioned, and I went to work at Bell Northern Research, which was the research arm for Northern Telecom or Nortel Networks. Great technical environment, a lab, sort of fun as you could be. And this is where I learned another one of the key lessons, is the impact of a mentor. I had my mentor who, for whatever reason, saw something in me and decided to take it upon himself to try and improve me. I have since decided to pay it forward, and I have mentored a lot of people, but he was influential at Van Nest. He got me to understand the world in a different way. He got me to understand about communicating with people, and I'll give you a few tips afterwards as well about communication. So the world started opening up for me at that stage, and by working hard again in that same theme, Nortel Networks had something like many big companies have, called a key resource list. And this is our people that they've identified to be on a fast track, to get promotions a little quicker, to get really cool jobs and so forth. So if any of you end up deciding that you're going to go into some of the bigger companies, this is the kind of thing that if you're looking for my kind of path, this is what you're looking for, is to make sure that you're getting noticed and getting put onto some of these lists as well. So one cool task led to even more cool tasks. And you'll see, I mean, there's no plan here, right? I mean, I went to be an RNT because I was moving to Ottawa, and now somehow I'm on this key resource list. But then I got what I thought was the thing that really catapulted for me, and that was BNRNT at the time had 9 different mechanical CAD/CAM CAE systems worldwide. And I got picked to lead the effort of trying to figure out how in the world we should go forward. Now, I'd been doing programming, and I knew about computer-aided manufacturing, numerically controlled machines, and so started doing mechanical CAD/CAM CAE. And there were 26 different systems out there in the world, so picked a cabinet of people, and we went and evaluated all of these things. Very, very high-profile task. At the time, it was. Now it seems sort of trivial, but at the time, it was very high profile. And this is another key, is every decision that I made, this is what interested me. I made no decisions ever in my career for anything related to money. No decisions ever about, this promotion leading to that. I was what I referred to as a heat seeker. I always wanted to be in on the really nasty, big problem that nobody else wanted to touch. That's what I wanted to be. And it turns out that there's a lot of visibility on the big, hairy problem. And so for me, I've seen a lot of other people, what they're trying to do is to get by without failing. That, if I can just sort of do one role after another without disturbing things too badly, maybe I can get that next role. And for me, that was just like the most boring thing possible. For me, it was, give me the nastiest problem you have and just let me go to it. So that also, all the way through in the career, you'll see as well. So that actually ended up leading to a decision, after all of these different evaluations, led to a decision to have all of BNRNT standardize on this one product called Pro Engineer. Now at the time, Pro Engineer was just being released. It since became the most successful CAD system of all time, but it was just in its release. It had almost no functionality to it, but the core, the crux of how it had been designed was so clear that it was going to be a world burner that I took, which at the time was a very, very large risk decision, and we standardized all of BNRNT on Pro Engineer. And the people at PTC, they're the ones that developed the software, had more than half of their R&D people just doing the work that I specified, because I was implementing hundreds of these seats all around the world My first order with them was larger than their entire installed base at the time. Just tells you how embryonic the company was. And so you see how each decision ends up getting me to a point where a lot of hard work gets you into the sort of the next step, because after having done all of these implementations and having led all of their R&D efforts from the outside, PTC then started trying to recruit me. So I was in Ottawa, they were in the Boston area, and I said, you know what? They're a really exciting company. Great, I'm going to go. And so another theme that you see, almost a self-selection that takes place, as Dr. Saravanamuthu will certainly tell you, is there's a self-selection of people willing to take their games across the country, borders, across different fields. So when I moved to the US, this was, huge and, a big, big step for me. I'm Canadian, but I was going to be going and living in the US, like so many people do, right? Going to school and so forth. But if you think back on your friends that haven't made that move, those of you that have moved countries, there is a self-starter aspect, a self-selection that takes place. Some people want to stay in the same environment and, for the whole time. For me, I just needed to do something else. There was this deep-set need in me. So I got to PTC, and just to re-emphasize the point about never making a decision for money, when I got to PTC, I was speaking with the head of sales, and he says, I think you're going to get the job. And I think, well, of course I'm going to get the job. I've been directing all of these efforts here. And he said, well, have they offered you any stock options? I said, stock options? I said, what's that? So I was making this decision, nothing at all to do with money. I really didn't understand any of it. So he explained it to me, stock option, probably people know now, at the time I didn't. But, you're given the option today to, at some point in the future, buy the stock at the to sell the stock at the higher price, but buy it at today's price. So I'm given an option today if the stock is trading at $10, and then 2 years from now, the stock is trading at $100. I pay $10, even though it's 2 years later, and I get to sell it for $100. And I remember he explained this to me, and I asked a few questions, and then I said, is this legal? It couldn't be, right? So, that's when I first got stock options, that when I first started developing a little bit of material success. But not because I had decided that that's what I wanted to do. It's just this was an exciting company, and they were going places, and I believed in the technology. So I jumped on board. And it turned out it was a very, very harsh corporate culture. And I had another mentor here, the founder of PTC, a guy named Dr. Samuel P. Geisberg, a Russian that had immigrated, Russian mathematician. And every day for the first 6 months, Sam was in my office yelling at me for an hour. That was just the culture. Everybody yelled at each other. It's like we were all angry all the time. And it was like, and then after 6 months, it's like a light switch went off, and Sam decided, you know what? Mark's tough, he can take it, so it's good. And then we became best of colleagues and friends, and he fired me 3 times. But each time, the other executives in the company, I was number 4 executive, number 4 or 5, the other executives would say, just come back tomorrow, he's probably fine. And so, remember, the first time he fired me was in that first 6-month period, right? And so I'm on a renewable visa, my wife has just moved down, my 6-month-old daughter, and the guy fires me. I thought, oh my God, sweat's pouring down here, didn't tell my wife. So I go in the next morning, Sam comes into my office and starts yelling at me at the top of his lungs about some new problem, and I wanted to hug the man. It's because, oh my God, I haven't really been fired, or he forgot. So it was a very, very harsh culture, completely different, and I'm not suggesting that you go and, seek out a harsh culture like that, because I've, since that time had the opportunity to create many, many cultures as being the CEO or the chairman of quite a number of companies, and I've never chosen to replicate that. It worked for that period of time. It was the greatest collection of corporate intellect that I had ever met to that point and since. It was unbelievable. But if we could have just taken that little bit out of it, I would have been totally fine with that. It was a very, very high-profile, high-flying Wall Street performer. I did not know that. We went public, and the stock just kept going and going and going. I kept getting these stock options. I kept buying stock on something called the Employee Stock Purchase Plan. So if any of you are in companies and you have that opportunity, I counseled so many hundreds of people that worked for me to maximize their contributions to these types of programs. On an Employee Stock Purchase Plan, you actually get to pay a 15% discount to the lowest price on a 6-month period. So whether the stock goes up or the stock goes down, you still make money. So, you know, these types of programs, for people that paid attention to them, you could make a fair amount of money with them as well. And so I just maximized my values that went into those as well. So usually companies are trying to make sure that there are programs in place such that you will stay. Because it's really hard to recruit good people and even harder to keep them. Because there's so much competition for great brains like yours. So people try, corporate entities like myself, try and put programs in place, either benefits programs or stock option programs or whatever, to try and make sure that people are going to stick with you all through this period of time, because it's also extremely costly to turn people over. And I'll make a couple of points about that as well. So if you do end up going to these, then certainly pay attention to the types of programs that people have in place. So here we were doing great. The technology was unparalleled in this space. Everybody eventually catches up, but at one period of time, in addition to my other roles, I had the benchmark team. So I had 20 plus people flying all over the world just doing technical benchmarks of our product against other people's products. And in 5 years that I was there, we never lost a single technical benchmark anywhere in the world. Now the product is good. It was exceptional as well, but that also takes a competitiveness aspect that just says, I will not lose. And so the people that were in that benchmark team, and maybe a little bit of me as well, hates to lose. So that kind of becomes part of your psyche when you're in these corporate entities as well. And if that's not you, it's okay. But I'm saying that's just part of what ends up having to happen when you want to try and make a success in the world. Because everything ends up being hard in corporate America, corporate Canada, corporate world. Everything is hard because somebody is always trying to come and compete with you. And so, this just becomes part of your persona, is trying to find a way to overcome. And so that benchmark team really did a lot to form with me this sort of basis of, I cannot lose. I have to find a way to win. By the way, this is also where I first started appreciating salespeople. Remember I had said before that for me they were failed engineers, technical salespeople. They couldn't do the math. But how wrong, it really sometimes frightening to me just how wrong I can be on so many points. Because nothing happens until two people meet and one gets sold. It really is as simple as that. Somebody ends up always having to go and sell perhaps your ideas, or perhaps you're going to be the salespeople. And as you move up in the corporate world, everybody sells. I mean, I eventually ended up, I like making a joke that says I couldn't sell breath to a dying man, but I've had to sell stuff as well. When you do stock offerings, you're actually selling stock. And I did get involved in every large deal at PTC and every one of my subsequent companies as well. So it is a very important skill to be able to sell and communicate your ideas. And I'll also make a couple of points about that as well. So, I was a very visible guy at that point. PTC was a high flyer. I was being interviewed all the time. Industry analysts, financial analysts, stockbrokers, all that kind of stuff. I was getting 1 to 2 job offers a week, very, very high profile guy. And I still wasn't moving. My next job was going to be a CEO job. That's what everybody was offering me. And I had no interest. I'm saying, I probably could have made more money, but I loved what I was doing. I was having a great time. Fantastic, I'm not moving. But then there was a competitive threat. Remember saying everybody competes in corporate America, and you're always trying to find a way to win. Well, this new company started up called SolidWorks, and I saw it from its beginnings, and I felt this was going to be a disruptive force in our industry. Our business model was no longer going to work. So I tried convincing the two people, CEO and president in the company, that we had to change. We had to make some very serious adaptations. And I was unable to convince them. So every week during our staff meetings in between, I would raise these points and felt like I was dancing naked on a table to try and get attention. Nothing. All I would get is a beating in return, saying, come on, you know, look, they can't do anything, can't model anything. And I said, yeah, but when we started, we couldn't either. And so eventually, I felt I had to leave because I was unable to convince these two guys that I felt I was right and they were wrong. And I couldn't be supportive. And if you're not totally in, you're actually on your way out. So I left. I accepted one of the job offers that had been coming my way. And finally, so it was a CEO job. But you'll notice I never aspired to be a CEO. That wasn't how I started. It's not what I sort of had in my mind. It's just, that was my next step, my next logical step. And this is the name that the private equity people that were backing the company gave me, because I was quite young. I was 34, I think, something like that, 34, 35. And I looked young, not the broken down old man you see before you now, but you know, I was actually sort of a hot property at the time and young and energetic. And it was my first gig, so it was a company called Mold Flow. And most of you probably don't even know that, even though it was a household name in the engineering world for a long period of time. When I eventually left, we had about 85% market share. It was like Kleenex. People would talk about doing a mold flow analysis. The brand had been so established. But when I actually started, this was the first time I was doing turnaround. Remember, everything I'd done was growth before that. But when I came in, the private equity guys said to me, you know, there's some problems. But I'm sure you can resolve them. I said, all right, problems. Heck, I live for problems. Give it to me, right? I'm the heat seeker. So I get into the company. It's my first CEO gig. So I don't, you know, they don't actually hand you out the CEO handbook right at the beginning. You sort of have to get that later. And so, wow, I guess I should probably know how much cash we have in the company, right? It's sort of like your bank account. You probably want to know how much you've got in your checking account and how much room you've got on your credit card. Well, they didn't have any such system in place. So I made my edict. You know, we're going to put in place a cash flow forecasting system. And so weeks and, you know, millions of lives, thousands of years kind of thing. And eventually we had a cash flow forecasting system. Now, Mold Flow was actually an Australian company. So I was traveling to Australia all the time. I went there 21 times, back and forth, back and forth. My job was to move the headquarters operations to the US and perhaps eventually take it public. That was the goal of the private equity guys. So when I get down there to Australia, I'm tired and so forth, and I come in and the CFO, Chief Financial Officer, says, I got good news and I got bad news. Now I was still young, remember, I was the boy CEO, right? So I didn't really understand that when somebody says, I have good news and I have bad news, what they really mean is they have bad news and worse news, but they're trying to dress it up. So I got good news and I got bad news. And I said, great, I could use some good news, because everything was terrible in the company. Everything was terrible. I started firing people in the first meeting that I showed up in. Another story, probably for the break afterwards. But so what's the good news? He says, cash flow forecasting system is working. Ah, fantastic. That's great work. What's the bad news? We have 2 weeks of cash before we have to close the doors. I did pretty much the same thing then, too. Take a pause, saying, oh, I'm a heat seeker, but like 2 weeks, I can turn an entire company around. So I called my private equity backers that night and described it. And I was very transparent and have been throughout my career with my board of directors, just very open, and said, look, here's where we are. And I had 2 directors on my board of directors at that point that were from my private equity partners, and that was Ampersand Capital. And the one that I was speaking to, I described the whole thing. I said, we got 2 weeks of cash left. He said, Mark, don't worry. It's just money. We can fix that one. You go and fix the company. It's going to get ugly. It's going to get really uncomfortable. But we will get through this. And he bought so much loyalty with me for the rest of my career as a result of that. I did end up going to work for Ampersand later on, as I'll describe. But that kind of interaction is formative in all of your career. And you'll see how that comes back, you know, in a couple of slides. Is I've developed such strong relationships with a few key people that either I worked with, or who have reported to me as well. And those relationships are actually what do take you through all the business. is because you are your reputation, you are how people think about you and how they perceive you to be. Guard that one jealously, is how people look at you and how people respect you. That loyalty is something you cannot buy. So for me, when he said that, I said, look, I don't understand how any of it's going to work, because I didn't really. But he tells me to just put my head down and go fix the company, and so I did. And so I turned off a whole pile of software development projects they had going on. You know, I looked at some numbers, and it was clear that this didn't make a lot of sense. And so I brought the 12 greatest minds in the company. These were the world leaders in this injection molding simulation space. That's what Moldflow did. I brought them together into a room, closed the door, all engineers, physicists, mathematicians. I had some background in that. As I told you, I'd written software with the National Research Council and with my ICAM job. And I described on the board, here's what we need to develop. We need to develop a completely new form of analysis. Now, I don't care if it's going to be finite element, finite difference, boundary elements. I don't care. We need a computational method that's going to do all of these things so that we can appeal to the design community. And we're not leaving here until we have it scoped out. And those 12 minds came up with something that a pile of patents got issued for it. It saved the company. We took us from 2 weeks of cash to eventually we ended up going public, initial public offering of stock in the year 2000, March 28th. And it became the most successful IPO of the year if you measure the price that it went out at and the price that it ended the year at. It was the most successful IPO of that year, so very, very successful stock. So a few things on that is the way private equity works is they buy parts of the company, and then afterwards when they sell the company, they get their money back, and hopefully they made more money than they invested. And they have these things called funds, right? And so they pull together $100 million, $1 billion, whatever. And from that, they make these investments, and then they return it to the people they got the money from. So Moldflow returned the equivalent of the entire fund for the private equity partners. So it was extremely successful for those private equity backers of the company. And so I started understanding a little bit more about private equity at that point. And now I had been doing this job in Moldflow for 5, 6 years, and I decided, you know what? It's time for me to go. It's time for me to retire. So that's what my next step was. Now, it's not that I actually intended to retire forever. I think I was 41 or 42 years old, but I decided that I was going to. Because when we were doing this stage, I had worked beyond crazy hours. Remember, my wife was taking care of everything at home. But, you know, we had these competitors like everywhere else. And, you know, I always hate telling these types of stories because it makes it sound like, you know, woe is me and put on your helmets for the war stories. But, you know, this is part of what got me to where I am. So we had something that we called an imitate and price competitor. So this is a very technical field. We were pouring money into R&D, these great minds coming up with really cool stuff. And then we had this one competitor that would look at what we had developed, put a team of people on it for a few weeks, come up with something that looked like a vague facsimile of it, put it out in the marketplace at 10% of the price. And some people would go and buy that because it was 1/10 of the price. And then over time, over years, they would try and evolve it more and more. It was so blatant at some points as I actually first brought attention to them because every single one of their press releases was a carbon copy identical to my press release with a global search and replace done of the Moldflow name for their name, my product name for their product name, and it was every one of their press releases. So we sent it out to them. This is the way that they competed. So at one point we had built a very complex, full three-dimensional Navier-Stokes solver to do all of this stuff. I think it was 20 man-years of work we had put into it. And they come up with something like 6 months after we release. And I'm thinking, that's not possible. How could that possibly be? So I sued them. Didn't really have the basis. I just knew something was wrong. I didn't have any money. We weren't public at that point yet. We had virtually no cash. My board was saying, are you out of your mind? You're going to pour money into lawyers' fees? And I said, I don't know how, but I know I'm right. So I sued them. And on discovery, it turned out to be much worse than we had ever expected. They'd actually stolen all of our code through a mole that had pumped the code to them, and on the first day that he arrived, he set up a lecture like this with 27 people in their company to explain how it all works over a period of multiple days. So the most egregious case you could possibly imagine, I was right in the middle of doing our IPO documentation, and I get a call from their CEO that says, hey, why don't we put this behind us? Only the lawyers are going to make money. Why don't we find some resolution? And I knew I had them. So I bought them. And I amended the IPO documentation, it's called an S1, to be able to buy him at the same time that we were going public, because I didn't have any money. And so when we did that combination, and I asked our accountants and our attorneys, our bankers, I said, so has anybody ever tried to do this before simultaneously? He said, no. I said, well, is this impossible? They said, no, you're going to be fine. And it just turned out that none of them wanted to be the only one to say they couldn't do it. But when we did pull it off, it had never been done before. And then the IPO window, because you know, like in the stock market, sometimes stocks are in favor, sometimes they're out of favor. Well, the crash was just happening then. If we had taken 1 day longer to do this transaction, we would not be public, and I'd be flipping burgers at Burger King. So there's that lucky aspect again. I wrote the entire S1 in a weekend on my own and gave it to them. So there's the hard work part that set it up so that we could. And then we also got that transaction done as well. So see those themes I keep talking about? So then after all of that, I decided I'm just going to take a bit of time off. And Ampersand Capital was calling. I had obviously returned them a lot of money. They liked how some of the stuff that I did work on. So they asked me to become a full-time general partner. There were 5 of us responsible for all of the investments. 2 of these guys, remember, were on my board that had bought my eternal loyalty, still have it. They're some of my best friends as well. And so, you know, here it was a very different world for me. It's buying and selling companies instead of operating them. It's a partnership versus a hierarchy. Now, I've never emphasized hierarchical relationships in the corporate world, but everybody knew as the CEO I was eventually the decision maker. But in a partnership, it's very different. It is all, you have to influence each other. You have to find a way to get to a common resolution. So very different business model than everything that I had before. 10-year funds as well. So pretty much when you go out and raise money from pension funds and from endowments and so forth, you're signing on for 10 years. You know, so it's not that you get all this money and you stand there in front of, you know, the Ontario Teachers Retirement Plan, and you say, yeah, this is what we're going to do. They give you the money, and then the next year you go somewhere. No, they expect you to be there for 10 years. So very, very different kind of model that takes place there as well. Now, Ampersand turns out to be very, very successful private equity firm. It's but probably the one that nobody has ever heard of. Never heard of it, right? Because all of us were exactly the same as we hate the limelight. Hate it. All through my career, I've always tried to put other people to make sure that they're the visible person. I like being in the background, and so do all of my other partners as well. But we've been, my private equity partners and I, Ampersand has been doing private equity for more than 25 years. And all of you, I'm sure, have got some awareness about the stock market and the ups and downs of how things went in 2008 and so on. But if you had made investments in all of Ampersand's funds, all the way through from 1980-something until now, you would have never lost money in any fund. They've never failed to return capital. And you would have gotten every year 25, 26% return on your money, every single year. And all of those guys that I was working with have exactly the same mentality as me, is just looking for places with really nasty problems to go and solve that look interesting. So that's how I ended up getting into venture capital and private equity. And it's a very different model. And you know, like I said, there's some positives and some negatives, but very different business model. So one of the companies that we bought was a Toronto-based company. That's what you do in private equity. You look for companies that are in some degree of distress and see if you could buy them and make them better and then sell them for more than you bought them. It's pretty simple, right? Pretty easy. So we found this public company, Rand Worldwide, was trading on the Toronto Stock Exchange, Canadian company, undermanaged, all sorts of problems with it, so it seemed like exactly right. And so we went and bought the company by putting a tender offer for all of the shares. and bought all of them, and then we started the turnaround. And it's the most difficult turnaround of my entire career. And I've done some nasty ones, but this one, it was an exorcism of a bad culture. It was, people seemed to have just accepted that they were going to lose. And I ended up replacing every executive, and except one, and almost every manager in the company. Because I just kept having to get people out of the way that had come to accept mediocrity, that just come to accept that, this is the way it is and we're not going to win. And instead, we needed a population of people that believed that they were going to win. So, since I'd terminated everybody, almost, I started making phone calls to people that had worked with me before. And 100% of the people that I called who had worked with me before dropped the jobs they were in and came to work with me again. And that was one of the most gratifying parts of my whole life, is all of that work, that loyalty stuff, that dealing with people transparently, being right there with them, reputation, it mattered. And most of them are still with me now as well. Is that people that, if I were to move companies, I have a very strong belief they would say, hey, when can I expect the phone call? Let's go. I'll come to the next one. So reunion with former colleagues. So now I had bought the company, and right away in almost the first month, I started making phone calls to the biggest competitor of Rand Worldwide. And I said, look, I just bought the company. I believe we should start talking about merging your company and my company. Rand was bigger than the other company called Avitech, but I still felt that the two should work together. But there'd been a lot of distrust built up over many, many years of these two companies competing with each other. So I started making a call at least every quarter to their CEO, describing what I was going to do next with Rand, and then I'd go and do it. And then I'd call them and tell them I did it. And I kept doing that every quarter. And so finally, after about 2.5 years, they accepted to speak with me. I spoke with their board, convinced them that we should merge these companies, and we put a deal together and put these two companies, became the behemoth of this industry, by far eclipsing everybody else, and that buys us a huge amount, we believe. But it took about 2.5 years to overcome a lot of the prejudices and the biases and so forth of a lot of wounded egos from the time. So then I actually got to pick the best of both companies, because I was merging people in this company with people from that company, and I just went and cherry picked. These are the equivalent roles. You've got that role. You've got this one. And so now I really had the talent field that I needed. And so we had the team in place, and we needed me to do something that I don't like doing, and that was becoming extremely visible. We needed one person that was going to pull together and lead. Usually I like to put other people up front, but here I was extremely visible, visiting every single site. We have 48, 49 locations in North America. We have 45,000 customers. So I was extremely visible during that merger time, just to get people working on a common theme. Now, thankfully, I can go back into being in the background and mentoring others to do that visible work, where I'm much, much more comfortable. But through all of that, I didn't like the business model. And the premise at the beginning with the private equity investment was that we would create some new products and new services and stuff. Turned out that they didn't know it at the time, but they were losing about 26 cents on every dollar of services that they would make. So they'd get $1 in revenue, but it would cost them $1.26 to achieve that revenue. Doesn't work over any kind of a period of time. So we had to fix that, and we created a whole new product area, which is this data governance field, which is exploding right now. I still give very, very little visibility on this. We are a public company. I give very little visibility on it, but it is exploding right now in a new product area. And I've had a good track record here, and people have asked me in the past, Mark, how do you keep coming up with products that people will buy? And it's really simple. I just ask them. I go and I visit with customers, and I ask them what the problems are that they have. And then I build solutions to fix them. And I sell it to them. And now people say, that can't be that easy, because everybody would go and ask them. I say, well, no, actually they don't. Instead, what they're doing is they go and they broadcast what they have instead of listening to what's needed. That's the whole difference. So when you're building products, a whole lot more listening and a whole lot less talking pays off in dividends. So that's how we ended up creating this whole new product area that's doing extremely well. All right, so that's the career. By the way, one of the things that I'm here for is we're always recruiting. Here's my shameless plug number one. And so go ahead onto our website, send me your resumes. We're always recruiting. Not always hiring, but we're always recruiting, and I'll talk a little bit about that as well. But we do have a ton of locations, and there are product areas that are growing fast and furious. And so as each of you ponders your next steps after school, software is a great place to be. All right, so what's fundamental to success? As I have this retrospective, and I'm very near the end of my career, much more so than near the start of the career anyways. I've already talked about it, right? Being lucky. If you can't be lucky, well, at least set yourself up with a whole lot of hard work, reputational, make sure that you really live up front with people. And you'll see that reflected here as well. But there are a couple of other things that I learned along the way. And one is communication. If you cannot communicate your thoughts and ideas, sell them in a sense, you're on your own. Now imagine that you have some entrepreneurial gene, that you want to do something in the entrepreneurial world, but you can't convince anybody else that your idea has any merit. You're done. Everything requires many people to participate. Everything requires a team environment. Everything requires your ability to be able to communicate your thoughts effectively, to speak effectively. You cannot, at the end of a discussion when the person dismisses you, say, "What an idiot." No, actually, you have to look at yourself. Remember that working hard and changing? You have to look at yourself and say, why was I unable to connect with this person and communicate my thoughts and ideas? It's fundamental. Recruiting. Nobody is able to achieve success without recruiting the best talent that's out there. I hope that theme came through a few times. I have terminated entire senior management teams after I've bought companies. I've stepped into areas and terminated almost everybody. And other times, I haven't had to do that at all because the right structure was there and the manager was actually the problem. But if you cannot recruit people, hire people that are going to dedicate themselves to the task as well and line up with you, you cannot be successful. It's too hard out there. So recruiting, I think, is fundamental. And then having recruited them, if you can't manage them, they're not going to stick around. So management, I think, is also critical because there's no way to be successful on your own. Okay, so just a couple of words about communication. This took me too long to figure out, so hopefully this is a gem for you. If you have interest in the world of business, you cannot be successful until you speak the language of finance. I always felt I would see people looking at financial statements and they had some kind of a secret decoder ring. I would see numbers, they would see a whole story there. They'd be able to make these conclusions and say, oh, look what's happening here and here. And I would say, where? How do you get that? Until you can speak finance, which means being able to understand income statements, cash flow statements, and balance sheets, you're always going to be a bit of an outsider. Always going to be just a bit of an outsider. And you have to communicate with these finance people. So if you don't speak their language, remember the point I just made about you have to be able to effectively communicate? That doesn't mean just to other engineers, to other business people. It means to everybody. So try this technique. I do this all the time when I'm mentoring young people that have tremendous talent, but are in constant broadcast mode, not really paying attention to the cues that they're getting back from people. Before you say something, come up with 3 different ways in your mind of saying it, and then decide which one of those methods is most likely to give you the reaction that you want. And I'm sure already some of you are thinking about some scenarios that say, yeah, I guess I could try this or try that, but most of the time people end up with this one broadcast method, this one tool that they use, and it's not working. You're not getting the reaction that you wanted from it. So before speaking, engage the brain and think of 3 different ways to say it, and then consciously pick, this is how I'm going to say what I'm about to say. Because that allows you to speak to your audience in a way that they can understand. So if you're speaking with a finance person and you start talking about energy minimization techniques or computational methods or strain energy or whatever. But if you also talk to somebody in product development about deferred revenue and revenue recognition rules and VSOE and other accounting terms, and it doesn't even have to be that broad of a difference. Sometimes you need to think about where's that person coming from and how do I get my message across to them? And it's hard. That's why I was saying changing the way that you deal with people is hard work. But if you just keep saying, boy, that finance person, he's never going to get it. You know what? That finance person is the person that's writing down the scoreboard, because the financial statements end up being the scoreboard for everything once you get to interpret them. So communication is absolutely key, absolutely fundamental to everything you do, and learn about financial statements and then speak to your audience. Now, recruiting. Here is my secret, and it's been developed over many, many years. The managers that work for me can almost all of them recite this as a credo. I look for honest, ethical, straightforward people with a positive disposition that will just plain outwork you. Honest, ethical, straightforward people with a positive disposition that will just plain outwork you. You notice there's nothing about experience here. There's nothing about, the person's got this background in this computational thing or whatever. All of that stuff can be taught. You guys will have proven that you are teachable, that you can learn at this highest level. I don't really care about that. But as soon as your honesty or your ethics are in doubt, I can't believe anything you say anymore. So when now you tell me something, the customer said this, I'll find myself saying, did the customer really say that? Or is this your agenda that you're giving me? And you can't be successful when you're constantly doubting each other on the team. Honest, ethical, straightforward. If I have to wonder about what's his agenda? What's he trying to push here? You're not going to end up being part of a team and being successful. Instead, you should be, again, this is just my approach, very open, very honest with your approach and saying, look, this is what I believe. I could be right, I could be wrong, but very transparent. At the board level that I've experienced for quite some time, people know that as well with me. I'm very open, very transparent. I do some positioning, as you have to. Any success is always the team's success, and any failure is my failure. And that's not for show. That is actual truth. If things have gone well, it's usually because the team has done things effectively. If things have gone poorly, it's usually because I've assigned the wrong tasks or I've put the wrong people onto it. It's usually my fault. So there's a little bit of positioning that takes place in it, but transparency leads to those 100% of the people coming and wanting to work with you again, that reputational aspect. Positive disposition, because if every day you've got to come in and you've got to pump up Joanne or Fred or Sam or whatever, say, come on, you can do it. It's too tiring. I mean, this is hard work. You need people that are self-motivating, and when you're not around, that they're just as pumped up as you. And then they'll just plain outwork you, right back to that differentiator as well. I look for people that are going to be better than me. Some people are very threatened by that. Sort of they're B players, and they're looking for other people to be a C player or a D player so they won't get shown up. I want everybody on my team to be an A player. I don't care if I end up not being the guy that looks the brightest. That's totally fine with me. I want people that are going to outwork me, that when I start at 5 in the morning, usually I start about 4:30, 5 o'clock in the morning with emails, and I get up and people have already started sending me some. I think, yeah, now we're kicking it. This is great stuff. So I want people that meet up with this. By the way, just one other one I didn't put on here, but my experience has also been the people that I hire, I try and look for equal measures of fear of failure and need for success. A fear of failure and a need for success. If you only have a fear of failure, you do like some of the people I mentioned earlier in the talk. You're trying to skirt around, never taking a risk, never trying to solve the big problem. You're part of the wallpaper to me. But if you have only a need for success, then you take crazy chances. you're not thinking about consequences. You're not thinking about how bad it could be. So the equal measures for me, and that one, I don't know, if that's sort of like born or developed or whatever, but somehow you should be feeling like that's where I need to be. And then the last one in terms of this as well is just some notes for you. People think about management, but they don't think about the specifics on it. I actually think there are 7 different rites of passage in management. So when you get your first level supervisory job, so remember you're going to get hired for some role, and then if you're aspiring to do something in business, you will want to move up in management. You're going to get your first level supervisory job. Then you'll start managing managers. Then you'll start managing managers outside of your area of expertise. Then you'll start working to financial constraints. Then executive management, eventually perhaps a CEO. And then all through that, there are board positions that are slightly different as well because they don't have the same degree of scrutiny since you're a group on a board. But these are very different skill set requirements. And if you can extract yourself from the heat of the moment and sort of think about the processes that are going on in terms of management, maybe you grow as a manager and eventually get to that CEO role. So now, as I said, I'm pretty close to the end of my career instead of certainly much closer than the beginning of the career. So right now for me, I just get motivated by this stuff. I like helping people grow as managers. I like mentoring people, developing them, and I really like creating something where nothing existed before. It's kind of like, you get to my stage and I'm not a terribly, terribly wealthy guy, but I don't really need more money. That's not really what motivated me in my career anyways, and it certainly doesn't motivate me now. Instead, these are more the things that are interesting to me. But if after you see this or you think about it a little bit more, you'll see that pretty much is what motivated me all through my career as well. By the way, if you want more tactical information on being an entrepreneur, shameless plug number 2 here is Bill Ouellette is the guy that runs the entrepreneurship program at MIT, the Sloan School of Management. And I've done a couple of guest lecture spots there as well. He captured what I think is one of the best books on this topic. It's called Disciplined Entrepreneurship's 24 Steps to a Successful Startup. I think, like I said, shameless plug, feel free to disregard it, but when I've read a number of these books before, I think that this one really does give you a step-by-step approach as to if that's where your thinking is, look, I don't want to go into big corporate America, I want to start something. I think that this could be a very helpful text for you. So those are the comments that I had. Usually, people put up something that says questions now. Instead, I fly my own airplane, and so that's my airplane right now, and everybody that I was meeting with today, as soon as I tell them that, they actually don't care about anything else that I talked about. They just want to ask me questions about flying in airplanes. And if you want to ask about that instead of anything else, man, I will talk about this like till the cows come home. So there you go. So those are my prepared remarks, and I'm happy to take any questions that you might have.
Hi.
Oh, sorry.
It's been a pleasure hearing you. So my question is, when you try to manage people managers who are dealing with things that are outside of your expertise, what are the things that you consider for making sure the quality of their work?
Yeah, that's why each one of these, the question, did everybody hear the question? That's why each one of these rites of passage sort of follows in sequence except for the board role, because you sort of grow on your experience. Because what you have to do when you're outside of your area of expertise is you have to really rely on reading people and interpreting, listening very attentively. Because you'll start to spot where people are not giving you the full story. And it's just because you've done so much other management that you're saying, no, hold it a second. Something's not right here. And you'll start questioning, you start getting into them. You'll never be able to become as proficient as they are. That's why it's another rite of passage. Prior to that, like when you get your first level supervisory job, I felt when I got mine, I was able to do the entire work of the department. I felt I probably could have fired all of them and done it all on my own if I was willing to do so, because I knew everything going on in the projects. Then when you're doing managing managers within your area of expertise, the simple volume of work doesn't allow you to do it. But you know so much about what's going on that you can just, your bullshit detector is going and you just know No, hold it a second. You told me this software is going to be done here, that module was going to be whatever. Then you have to use that to catapult into the next one where somebody's now telling you some marketing thing. When I first took over marketing, everybody's so nice and pleasant in marketing, and everything is always so perfect. And you have to start like digging into, hold a second, take me through all of it. And you start getting them, you have to be very pedantic with them, one step at a time. Tell me how this is going to work. And you'll see pretty quickly when it's not really thought out, people start stumbling quickly. And you say, well, wait, hold a second. I thought you said that this was going to be done by here. And as you sort of evolve a little bit, you just start picking up on things that are not right. And then you can solve the problem together. But that's one of the key steps and why it is its own rite of passage is you have to rely on all of your other management skills to be able to detect when things are not where they should be. By the way, I have a simple rule of thumb that I've used all through my career as well. I keep capturing all this stuff in a book that I've been writing for my whole career, which I will certainly never publish, but it's everything on these management techniques. Marc's cliches is one of the sections. I have 23 of them, I think, of things I've developed over time. And one of them is somebody who's reporting to me can never come and ask me for an extension to a project longer than the time remaining on the project. So, if there's a 6-month project due and there's 2 months left and they come and they say, we're going to have a 4-month slip. That is not an acceptable practice, and that person is going to be gone from the role. And I make sure that people understand it. Because what that does is it highlights that you need to get me bad information quickly. So you'll start to develop your own techniques as well of how do I detect that there are problems when I don't have my own expertise to be able to do it. That rule of thumb has helped me quite a bit in the areas that I'm not as much of an expert. I think there was a question here.
Yeah. So it's become
hold it a second. Ruby's running.
Thank you. So it's become clear that you've had some pretty big decisions to make throughout your career. And I'm just wondering how you've been able to teach yourself to avoid making emotionally based decisions, especially when you're dealing with finance and business.
Yeah. So the question is, how do you make sure that your decisions are largely rational and not as much emotional? So I actually, I don't know how I came up with this, but this is something that I started doing when I was at PTC. People that reported to me hated it, but I had this little pad of paper, like those giveaways, that you tear one sheet off, a little pad like this, and I called it my prediction pad. Because what I found is that people would constantly evolve their position over time so that when something happened, they could say, you see, I told you all along. But actually, 6 months before, they had a completely opposite perspective. So they were being, in my view, intellectually dishonest with themselves. They were allowing themselves to migrate their position along until finally they were saying, knew it all the time. So I started forcing people and myself to write down what did I think was going to happen? And I would take the prediction papers, fold them up and put them in my drawer. And then we'd open them up 6 months, 8 months later and say, Marc predicted this. And it forced me to actually look at rational decisions instead of just constantly looking in the mirror and telling myself how good looking I was. It forced people that worked for me to do the same thing as well, because when they would start to say, you see, I've said it all the time. Really? Well, back here, May, you said whatever. So it's a discipline that comes into place where you, again, over time and over your career, where you force yourself to take context, to step away and say, look, I'm so emotionally invested in I want this to happen. But is it going to? And why do I believe it? What are the first principles? And to take the rational thought. I'll give you one more example, a much simpler example, not 6 or 8 months of duration. I never allow myself to make a compensation decision on the day that I'm asked. Invariably, through all of my management roles, CEO roles, somebody comes to me and says, we have to increase so-and-so's compensation to this or he's going to be gone. Do I have your approval? And it's really easy to get caught up in that emotion. And I say, no, let me go and review it. And it's astonishing to me the high percentage of time that when I start to review it, the facts are not 100% what was presented to me. But that's a discipline that takes place to say, everybody calm down, take a breath. Let's get some context. And that happens over a period of time where you just sort of say, boy, if I had thought about that, if I had allowed myself to take a little bit more time and provide some distance, I might have made a different decision. And forcing myself to predict what I really think is going to happen. I write this stuff down still, where I say, this is what I think is going to occur. And then I reflect on it. Why was I wrong? Or why was I right? So it's a discipline over time. Financial actually ends up makes it a whole lot easier because the numbers really do tell you a story normally if you're willing to listen to it. Sometimes, if you get too emotionally involved, you're not really listening very well. Okay?
Hi. I want to know if you have experience in your whole career about like those politics that always people play during like internal organizations, even in their private organizations or public.
Yep.
But people play that role like politics.
Yep.
Do this, push this here or around. Maybe it's going to work, or just get together to make it work.
Sure. Yeah. The question is, do I have experience with office politics? And the answer is yes, unfortunately. But I don't play them, and I've allowed myself that freedom by not working in a large company. Because when you're in a smaller company, there is no room to hide in office politics. When you got 10 people in a room, I mean, it's just us here, right? Just us chickens. So who are you going to be like playing politics with? And it's very open, very easy to confront. I think I have an advantage as well that I'm not afraid of conflict. And so I don't mind confronting people. Somebody who's, not comfortable with the conflict, it could be more difficult. But the smaller company already, you see it is much better, much less politics. The large companies, that's where people, politicians go to live. And so, even when I was at PTC, when PTC started, our office was no bigger than this room. When we started, no bigger than this room. And then over the period of 3 or 4 years, we expanded in the campus until we owned the entire campus. We went from, I think I was like 100th employee, and when I left we were 3,500 or something like that. When we had 100 employees, there was zero politics. When we had 3,500, there was politics developing, and I would do everything I could to try and stamp them out, but it's just the end-to-end problem just becomes too large that some will exist. So you can minimize it by going small, and all the rest of it I would say is the transparency and staying on message and on point wins over time. If you start getting caught up in little lies and positioning, people start looking at you as the office politician and not the other way around. And so for me, I just stayed on point, but then I set up the environment to make sure I didn't have to deal with them all that much because I just didn't really like that. It seemed like a waste of effort. But he sort of, how do I position this for the boss? Why don't you just tell him? So, okay. Okay, great. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Mark, for your inspiring talk and for sharing your experience and your insight with us. So it's been a pleasure listening to you. And I'm sure each and every one of us learned something that will inspire our their future career and our future thinking as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
There is a small
oh, thank you.
appreciation.
Much appreciated.
Thank you very much.